Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Ada Palmer. Ada is a historian and musician and author of science fiction and fantasy. She's an associate professor at the University of Chicago, a member of the History and Classics departments. She is also an award-winning science fiction writer and critic, and she's here to talk to us today about 3 books that she's working on. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
One of your books, the one that I'd like to get started with, is called Trace Elements, Conversations on Science Fiction and Fantasy, coming out later this year. So you talk in there about the letters that were being exchanged by readers of these early science fiction publications as far back as the 1920s, right?
Yeah.
And how these letter writers were kind of helping to define the genre. Can we get started with that? Tell us a little bit of that background. Sure.
We're familiar with the fact that there were stories in the 19th century we think of as science fiction, like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, but there was no name for that kind of fiction. It was just alongside other fiction mixed in with novels that people were writing, and somebody might write something that had robots in it, but all of their other stories wouldn't. There was no genre.
Interesting.
And it's in the 1920s when there's innovation of these giant pulp presses that make magazines incredibly cheap, and a huge range of new magazines on everything from fish keeping to fashion to science fiction start coming out.
Now, I remember these little paperback books with very yellow pages. Because they decayed early, I think. You're talking about magazines that predate the stuff that I was reading in the 1950s and 60s, right?
The magazines slightly predate it, but those books were printed with the same technology, the same cheap paper.
Yes, they were.
And so they were caused by the same innovation, which was now a book can cost a kid's pocket money so that you can buy a book instead of a chocolate bar, as opposed to a book being a more expensive object. So that led to a huge proliferation of how much reading everyone was consuming because it was suddenly affordable in the USA. Note that this was a big technology in the USA, very different developments in the UK and other places. But it meant that there were these magazines, the magazines had names, and it was in the 1920s that an editor called John Campbell started having these letter columns in the back of the magazines where people could write in and comment on stories or shared ideas. And he encouraged that and then would write replies to people, encouraging them to write their own stories. And he self-consciously developed a generation of readers to turn into writers. This was something that no editor had sat down and intentionally done before.
So this wasn't a case where they were getting more manuscripts than they knew what to do with.
It was the opposite. They had more pages to fill than they were getting manuscripts.
Interesting.
A heyday in which they
How long did that
couldn't print
last?
this stuff enough. It lasted until World War II disrupted things in terms of how much paper is available and so on. But that's a long enough period for the development and naming of a genre.
One of the things that is relevant here is that science fiction and fantasy kind of changes our understanding of what we know and what we don't know, right?
Yes.
And it expands our empathy towards other humans because of the way their things are portrayed in these books. Let's talk about the impact science fiction has for a minute here.
I mean, it has a lot of impacts. It means that every one of us compares our world to dozens of other ways our world could be. And we have lots of them thought through with second-order consequences and third-order consequences. What if this happened? What if society was set up differently in this way? What if government worked this way? People a couple hundred years ago didn't do that. They mostly lived in their own world and then comparing it to descriptions of other real ancient places, contemporary places. People in the Renaissance are comparing their world to what they know about ancient Rome, but they're not comparing it to 20 other or 50 other versions of their own reality.
Yeah, I guess in that sense, one of the advantages of college 100 years ago or whatever was that it exposed you at least to other cultures, which got you to look at things in a different way.
And to a few other worlds. But we hold our reality to a higher standard than any other age has, because it has to hold up to hundreds of imagined versions of itself.
I see.
And that leads to a lot of demand for change. There's a great phrase, speculative resistance, or even imagining what if the world were different in X way, what if X were more equal, is the sort of thing that begins people thinking, wait a minute, maybe we should demand that. So science fiction makes people take seriously ideas that wouldn't necessarily get explored. and then start asking for change with a new kind of vocabulary.
To what extent were these early readers aware of that? Was it sort of a mind-opening experience for them? Was it a
I mean, it was always a
revelatory?
mind-opening experience, but there wasn't a self-awareness of exactly how much the diversity and proliferation of worlds would be powerful.
Yeah.
Now, the shapers of SF between the 1920s and the 1950s did have a kind of a social engineering agenda, and that one of the goals of science fiction was to educate young readers about science so that the next era of humankind would be directed and ruled by this sort of scientifically educated intellectual elite that they thought they were
Star
raising.
Trek.
So it had a social engineering, very actually unegalitarian vision of a technocratic future that would bring about a golden age.
And that makes me think of Star Trek, because that really was the extension of that, right? But that's an exception now, isn't it? I mean, most of the science fiction we have now is not showing us a bright future, is it?
No, a lot of our SF, especially since the year 2000, is very grim. There are a number of reasons for that. Of course, there was grim stuff during the Cold War as well for different reasons.
Yeah.
But there was a kind of an interesting trauma that affected the whole society, especially through science fiction, around the year 2000. When we got to the year 2000, and we didn't have flying cars, and we didn't have robot butlers, and we weren't taking field trips to the moon. We don't even have a moon base.
But we could talk to our watches, I think.
We can talk to our watches, but all these promises that were made in Golden Age science fiction weren't kept, right?
Well, it's interesting. You look at this book called 1984, which is supposed to be about the future. Well, it didn't look like that when we got there.
Yeah.
Right? And many other
we're glad
movies you see now, and you look and you realize. I think Blade Runner. I think we've already passed the year for Blade Runner.
Yeah,
right?
we just passed the year for Blade Runner. We're close to when we're supposed to have contact with the Vulcans and break the light barrier and found the Star Trek Federation.
Yeah.
And in reality, it's taking a lot longer than that. Space turned out to be harder. And if you look back at the 60s and 70s, you can't find very many examples at all. I mean, there's maybe 3 of a book in which we are in the 22nd century and we're neither bombed back to the Stone Age or deep out in space, right? Either we were in the Stone Age or we were deep out in space. That was just going to be true by the year 2000. And so here we are in 2000. We're not deep in space. We have a toehold in space. It's harder. And there's a kind of mourning that the world goes into for that, that world of tomorrow.
Yeah.
And instead we have this world, and this is a world of tomorrow from the perspective of many things. The fact that information flows through our pockets in our magic mirrors is revolutionary, right? And I have the entirety of Diderot's Encyclopédie on my phone. Trivially, that's amazing, but it isn't amazing the way
what
we
AI is
thought.
doing, right?
And so there's a kind of a mourning and a coming to terms with, all right, space isn't easy. We're not going to be living on Mars in 20 years. If we're living on Mars, it's going to be in 100 years.
Well, when you think about it, there's no real good reason for us to live on Mars, is there? It's just
something we wanted to do.
It's just a goal, right? Yeah.
But humans do lots of things because we want to do them, not because we have to. What are the Olympics, right?
Right.
I would say that living on Mars and the Olympics are exactly the same spirit. We want to do it because it's hard.
Yeah, and what that means to change the world, right? So if we look at the major themes, utopias, dystopias, alternative societies, alien encounters, robots. Wasn't there a debate once about whether or not robots were going to be able to juggle? Did I read something about that?
Yeah, and there's amazing moments when, for example, Asimov thought that it would be harder to make a robot that could speak than that it would be to make a robot that would be fully self-aware and intelligent and able to move around and have relationships.
We're really starting to worry about that now. But so artificial intelligence, space travel is another area, and time travel, like I mentioned, and just advanced technology, right?
Yeah. I mean, these are what I and my co-author in the collection, Joe Walton, call the furniture of science fiction.
Okay.
The things that populate the room of science fiction. And you look around, and to tell if it's science fiction, does it have an alien? Does it have a spaceship? Right? But often those are the furniture. They're not the essence of the genre.
Right.
Science fiction tends to have messages and questions about how powerful is human reason and human ingenuity. What kinds of problems can it solve? What kinds of problems can't it solve?
Can good overcome evil, right?
Well, that's a larger theme that you'll see in all sorts of other genres.
Of course, yeah.
Whereas
So
in
you're saying these are
fiction,
unique to science fiction?
These are rarely absent from science fiction.
I
It's
see.
like, to tell if something is science fiction, it'll almost always have what are the limits of what human ingenuity can accomplish, for example, as one of the questions that's being asked. And how much does the society change, how quickly, and can we make it change intentionally, whether for better or worse, will almost always be in there. Whereas in other genres of literature, romance, mystery, whatever, they may be in there, they may not. Just as a mystery always has questions about what makes people choose evil. Science fiction sometimes has that, but doesn't always have that.
Well, if we go back to this utopian vision that was more prominent early on in the history of this, that kind of takes its last stand with the Star Trek episodes, does that reflect that maybe we've sort of given up some of our hopes for the future? And I also think of Dick Tracy. I mean, there was never anything negative about the future in the Dick Tracy stories, but they were always introducing this new technology and things. And
so there's
somehow that comic strip and that watch, right, became the symbol of everything in the future. Any thoughts on why that was and what happened to that?
I think there's an important difference between a good future and a utopia.
Okay.
Because lots of stories will depict, here's a future that is kind of cooler than the present.
Yeah.
And it has these things that are good about it, but these other things that are still wrong about it. And it's still
Yeah.
dynamic and changing in this way, which is very different from a utopia where the author is saying, here's an ideal future, and this is the way we should do things, not the way, the future could look. And utopias, originate well before science fiction originates with Thomas More, before that with Plato, and they were usually somebody lecturing on their ideal social mores and social structure, right?
Yeah.
Many of them are famous, but if you go to the 17th and 18th century, there are dozens and dozens of wacky utopias written by like weird fringe Calvinist religious movements about exactly how to set up the world. That's a utopia.
And movements of people forming communes and things like that, right?
Whereas what you're talking about is what I would call a future worth having, or a future worth living in, a future where we envision that the future is better than the present, but also still complex and dynamic and needing work. You don't see those as often now as you did before, but you do see them. In particular, there's a movement within science fiction right now called hope punk.
Hope punk.
Yes, hope punk.
Okay.
The idea of it being that when we are saturated with grim narratives and dystopia and post-apocalyptic things and grimdark, which is a very fashionable style in science fiction and fantasy, hope and depicting a future actually worth living in that you don't have to blow up and replace is a radical act.
Yeah.
And people underestimate how saturated we are with these things. But a couple years ago, I asked my friend in the creative writing program at my university, how many of your students are writing science fiction? And he said, 90% of my students are writing dystopia.
Oh,
Not science fiction, dystopia.
Dystopia.
Right? Just mountains and mountains of dystopia. Grim futures are sort of a default that people got saturated by. And so, when my first science fiction series, Terra Ignota, started coming out, even my agent, before it came out, said she kept being in literary meetings and everyone was talking about how tired they were of editing and publishing all these dystopias and apocalypses. And she said, I'm publishing this nice, complex, interesting story about a future worth living in. It has these problems and these good sides, and it feels different. It feels radical.
Yeah. Where do you see this headed? I mean, am I correct in understanding that we kind of came from I know there were some negative views of the future, like 1984 early on, but from a general sort of optimistic look at the future.
Well, and remember, Orwell, not a science fiction writer. Not coming from the science fiction tradition, not a reader of science fiction magazines.
Really?
Orwell was not considered a science fiction writer, and he isn't. All of his other work is literary fiction,
But he wrote a science fiction novel.
Barely.
Barely? Why do you say barely?
Because it hardly has any science fictional elements. It's an imagined society. It's not any more science fiction than Plato's Republic or Thomas More's Utopia
Oh, that's
are.
interesting.
Right? It has view screens, and that's it.
Really?
Yeah. There's almost no technology in Orwell's 1984. It's about society.
So do you think he didn't consider technology as because he was there at the, in the after wave of the Industrial Revolution.
Well, a huge amount of it is about specifics of World War II, right? And he's modeling things like the way the rationing worked on World War II. He's modeling the Ministry of Truth and its censorship on his wife, Eileen Blair, who worked at the Ministry of Information and went to work every day to censor people's mail.
But at a time when they were inventing rockets also, right?
Yeah. But if you think about it, all of the most famous dystopian novels are not by science fiction writers.
Oh, that's interesting.
Zamyatin's We, Huxley's Brave New World, Handmaid's Tale. These are all by people who don't identify themselves as science fiction writers, who are literary writers thinking about society with tiny bits of the furniture of science fiction in them. But for example, they don't ask the same questions about the future. Will human ingenuity shape it? How much power do we have? That you get in what I call imprint SF, meaning SF written by people who are reading things that are published as science fiction and responding to people that are to things that are published as science fiction.
I guess that's the group I was asking about then. Yeah,
exactly. There's a conversation of science fiction to which dystopia, and this is one of the chapters of the book, is actually much more of a mainstream genre than it is part of science fiction.
Yeah.
And it's almost always written by people who are not science fiction writers, or rather, who are not science fiction readers, and who are not shaped by, I want to respond to, Asimov and Ursula Le Guin and C.J. Cherry. They want to respond.
Let's look at what makes somebody a science fiction writer then,
well,
as opposed to just a reader.
Well, that's why I want to carefully say imprint science fiction
If we're going to make that distinction then, part of what you're saying is that there's a sort of a dialogue that goes on. To what extent do you think that the best work here is really reflecting themes that are in all kinds of fiction, human relationships and things like that? How important is that?
It's all definitely essential to it, and the strongest works in any genre are going to have the biggest themes, war, right and wrong, how we find meaning in the universe. But science fiction has a very refined set of tools now to work with.
Yeah.
And people who read it are used to those things.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. I have a friend who is a TV writer. And at one point was writing for a show that had science fiction and fantasy elements, but was a very simple show, and was pitching to the network a script that involved a vampire. And the executive asked, "What's the vampire's motivation?" And the writers said, "He wants to suck blood."
I want to suck your blood.
And the producer said, "You have to establish that for the audience."
Really?
And they were like, "Really?" But in fact, on television, you do, because it's trying to appeal to absolutely everybody, and somebody doesn't know what a vampire is.
They haven't seen Bela Lugosi.
Right? But when it's being printed in imprint SF, all your readers are familiar with this, and you can just drop in telepathy, or a time loop, or psionics, or pyrokinesis, and everyone's like, I know what that is. And you can talk about FTL or an Ansible, which is instant communication faster than light, and everyone knows what you mean, and you can jump past the 101 level straight to the 202 level in a way that you can't in television science fiction, in most science fiction movies, because they're trying to be for a broader community.
Right. So they have to use a shorthand that everybody's familiar with.
Well, or they have to reintroduce it and explain, here's how Spider-Man's powers work. Whereas when you get something that's printed by a company whose logo is a rocket ship, they're not going to explain to you how the powers work. You know perfectly well. They're not going to explain to you how the engine works in the spaceship unless they have a really cool new design for the engine, which pushes the boundaries of what's been done before. So much work has been done. And sometimes I look at early science fiction, I mean really early. So Voltaire has a short story, Micromegas, which is a first contact with aliens story. And aliens, giant aliens that are miles tall, travel to Earth. And they can barely see any organisms, but they can see whales. Whales are a little tiny. And they eventually detect that there's a ship and that there's something on the ship. And they pick up the ship on their fingertip.
I love this story. I didn't know about this.
Micromegas, and talk to it. And it's a first contact story. And the teensy human beings are talking to the giant aliens that live for tens of thousands of years. And as soon as they get in touch, they talk about whether Descartes or Thomas Aquinas is more correct about how to prove the existence of God. And that's not what we would talk to aliens about, because every era uses its own set of questions and then uses the tool, first contact, to look at that. What you ask an alien is very different in 1750 from what you ask an alien in 1920 or 1950 or 1980 during the Cold War. And science fiction has gotten better and better tools over time. I would love to see what Voltaire could write if he spent a year reading SF and knew what time travel and time loops and FTL were, and he would produce so much more rich ways to get at fundamental human questions, like how important we are in the universe. The same questions people have always been asking, but with new and sophisticated tools that science fiction has been accumulating over time. So in the same way that pharmaceuticals are better now because we have a whole bunch of machines we've invented to make better pharmaceuticals, and that's why cancer survival rates are up to 80% when they used to just be a death sentence. Similarly, science fiction has developed a whole bunch of awesome machines for exploring fundamental questions like the nature of war, but we can do it using FTL and flying cars.
It's almost as if this history of authors have put together a toolbox that anyone writing science fiction can access.
Exactly.
And,
and the more of it you read, the more of that toolbox you have.
Yeah, and that would be the difference between the science fiction writers and
the science fiction writer imprints SF science fiction writers and people
the
from other traditions.
The
who write
visitors
a
from
science
other
fiction
genres,
work.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So as we get to the end here, what does this bode for the future for us? We used to, think of the future as this wonderful place that we were going to, this wonderful environment we were going to achieve, and now we're looking at it as a dystopian environment. What does that say about us?
I think that says that we're bad at communicating what we actually know, which is to say there's a lot of good news in the world that just doesn't get reported. Almost nobody heard about the rollout of the malaria vaccine, which is going to save more lives than any other act in all of human history. Did not get publicized. Almost nobody knows that we're pretty darn sure 2023 is peak carbon, and we're now decreasing carbon because there was a mass solar rollout in China. There's an enormous amount of actually good news that just doesn't get to people.
Have you written a positive futuristic novel yet?
I have.
Okay, good.
But the important part of it is this. Since 1990, a little bit around 1985, there was an interesting change, not just in science fiction and fantasy, but broader in literature, in which the number of stories we tell about a single central protagonist who has the power to change everything became the vast majority instead of a slight majority of the stories we tell. Through most of the 20th century, you also got lots of stories about teams, and you got stories about where we're changing point of view a lot, or moving over time, or moving over generations. These were bestsellers. These were adapted into Hollywood pieces. That doesn't happen now. Think about how the old Mission Impossible TV series,
great example,
was about a team.
Yeah.
But the new Mission Impossible movies, it's Tom Cruise is the star and everyone else is supporting.
Yeah.
Hollywood
they sit back and watch him.
Right. Hollywood is one reason that this happened. Video games are another reason, because a lot of people consume narrative through video games. Video games are oriented around the player being at the core, and so they teach people how to tell stories about one hero. This leads to a big sense of powerlessness, because we tell ourselves story after story in which only one special heroic person has the power to change everything, and everyone else just has to sit back. Think about the first Marvel Iron Man movie, where it's Iron Man invented the gizmo that means there's not climate change in the Marvel universe. We're done, right? And those stories are bad for our sense of teamwork and our senses of activism. As a culture, we've come to be bad at narrativizing team achievement. We don't tell very many stories about what we really need and are doing to address climate change, which is hundreds and thousands of people all over the world are working, inventing, implementing, lobbying, reforming, and it's working. But it's exhausting. This comes back to why I say dystopia is in some ways not only a cathartic and an optimistic genre, but a slightly dangerous one, because it says you fight, you blow it up, and then you're done.
And you start over,
right?
maybe.
The hard work is building the better future. And hope punk books, a lot of them, like My Terra Ignota or Ruth Anna Emrys's Half-Built Garden, which is a very telling title, is about it's going to take generations.
Yeah.
And it's going to take teamwork. And we're going to be working at it next year, and we're going to be working at it 10 years from now.
Let's finish on that positive
We're
note.
going to be working on it 50 years from now.
So I think one of the points here is that maybe the future that we write about and make movies about is the one that we're headed towards, perhaps, right?
Or at
and
least
we need to think about what we're focusing on.
the
Yeah.
way we get to it.
Yeah.
You know, because we're writing hundreds of futures, but we get to all of them the same way, by most people sitting back powerlessly while a hero shapes what happens.
Yeah.
If we tell ourselves that, that's what's going to happen.
Okay, Tom Cruise, it's all over for you. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Palmer for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. See you next time.